Hi, and welcome back. We're going to talk today about transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas, and especially the experience of Eluda Equiano, also called Gustavus Vassa, whom we've encountered in the module inside Uncovering History. So just to quickly review, we've talked before about global trade networks in the early modern era, and this map, I think, signifies, we've got the Columbian Exchange, which begins in the 1492 and in the 15 and 1600s of new crops. We've also got all this trade and focus on the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And so you can see here, if you look closely, this has got a list of different kinds of goods that are going, circulating all around. We've talked a lot also about the silver trade. You can see here the silver coming and going both from New Spain. And so this important interconnected world that we see, I want to focus today on a particular aspect of this global trade, which is, of course, the slave trade. Before we start talking about the transatlantic slave trade, I just want to give you kind of, in some ways, a sad overview, in every way, the history of slavery, which is a practice that unfortunately is as old as human civilization. There's a long tradition, especially of enslaving prisoners of war, that goes back to the ancient times. Usually slaves were prisoners of war, their descendants, or criminals, people captured in battle. And you can see here on this map, there is slave trade that goes from the East African slave trade out this way, and then of course the transatlantic slave trade, which vastly eclipses it. You may ask, why does the transatlantic slave trade focus on Africa? I think it's important to notice that the English word slave actually comes from the word Slav, for Slavic people. And in fact, the earliest slaves in Europe were not Africans, but they were people coming from the area around Russia and Central Europe. And when the Ottoman Empire that we've talked about before, tied for second most powerful place in the world along with Mughal India, when the Ottomans come and take over Constantinople in 1453 and then continue their expansion over to Europe, they disrupt the trade routes that are traditionally from this area. And so that halts the flow of slaves. And so Europeans start looking elsewhere, and they start turning and spending more attention on exploring Africa. So there's already kind of a pattern here of trade, but it's very small. At its height, the East African slave trade is really only about 10,000 slaves a year. And by 1650, the transatlantic slave trade has really eclipsed that. So it's kind of why Africa. Let's think also about why the New World, right? Why is there this desire? Because there's way more enslaved people working in the new colonies than there are in Europe. And a huge part of that is because of the plantation system. You can see here in this map of different kinds of things that are traded. If you look closely, you'll see Europe has exports manufactured goods and luxuries, but especially also guns, cloth, iron, and beer. I said before that in the Indian Ocean area, there's not really that much that Europeans are making that other people want. Guns, and then eventually silver, right, which comes over kind of the other direction than this map is showing from around. And so we have this sense of trade. What we see with the peach-colored, pinkish-colored arrow is the trade of people. It's coming from all over. They've just localized it here so that's a little bit easier to read. It's not the only thing being exported from Africa. Also gold, ivory, spices, hardwoods like exotic woods are coming back to Europe as well. But you can see here a lot of what's happening is what's being produced is things made in this plantation economy, which is this farming agricultural based economy, especially rice, indigo, tobacco, to some degree silk, or less successfully, and sugar. Molasses is a byproduct of sugar. And so we have this huge international sweet tooth. And so sugar in many ways is fueling the slave trade. As you saw in the documentary Égalité for All about Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, sugar is backbreaking really difficult work. And nobody else will do it. So the locals, the natives, the Indians, Native Americans have died off in many of the places where sugar grows most readily. Nobody will do it for pay. Nobody will volunteer to do it. And so they enslave people and take them to force them to do this awful backbreaking work. The slavery era is also misrepresented because it also goes down to South America, but in any case. And so we see the destination of slaves. I think our cultural memory may be a lot of the American South and slavery, but you can see here that the vast, of the numbers, most people went to the Caribbean and then second to Brazil. And what we see when historians study what's going on in the Caribbean, for example, in Barbados, a really rapid growth of enslaved population. In 1645, when they start sugar plantations, just in terms of one generation, by 1680, the enslaved population has grown sevenfold. And so there's 40,000 enslaved people working on 350 different sugar estates in Barbados, in the Caribbean, and yielding 8,000 tons of sugar a year. A study of cemeteries in Barbados, doing bone scans and analysis, shows that the average life expectancy for an enslaved person was 18 years. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone born in zero, born and then dies at their 18, because many people aren't being sent here. There's a steady flow of the slave trade bringing people in, and plantation owners had kind of figured out how many years people needed to work before they could get their cost paid back. And after that, they don't really treat them very well, right? Not the whole time, because they know they're expendable. It's cheaper to buy a new person than it is to take good care of the people that you have. This is just another image about the sugar plantation economy, which I think is important to notice. So we need to pay attention to the transatlantic slave trade in particular, and I think that's one of the good things highlighted by this module, because there are just so many people involved. Let's go back and look at these arrows here. The thickness shows how many people. There are over 12 million people who are taken from Africa and sent across to the New World. And obviously the involvement of so many different countries, people within Africa, but also people from all the different countries of Europe are involved. And this kind of slavery is really different than what we see in other societies where we look at slavery. For example, in ancient Rome, you could have a slave who would be a tutor for your children, or a doctor for your family, a barber, sometimes the same thing. Here in the plantation economy system, slaves are really treated as dehumanized property, as livestock, really no more. And so we don't have this sense of fluctuating roles that they can play in society. We also have, I think, the issue of race, and the way that people who come from Africa look different, of course, right, than people who have come from Europe, the native, and from the people who were native indigenous people already living in the Americas. And so there's this sense that slavery is marked. So even if you're a free person of color, you're still associated with slavery. And I think those are issues that we're still dealing with, even till the present day, this legacy of slavery that's coded by the racial aspects of Africa versus European descent. So I think it's worth making sure that we pay attention to the transatlantic slave trade and what goes on. When we think about the slave trade, we need to think of it as two categories. There's an internal slave trade, how people are getting traded from within Africa, and then there's the external slave trade that we'll talk more about in a minute. And this is an image that shows us Africans taking other Africans. But of course, they wouldn't think of it that way. They would think of it as separate people, maybe with different languages, different family or tribal units, different civilizations, depending on the size of the society. And so there's not really a sense of, just like with Europe, an Italian or someone from Rome might not feel the sense of brotherhood with someone from Paris. We have the same kind of dynamics in Africa. This is explained really nicely in the flip book, the graphic narrative that you looked at for the Equiano module. This is just a still from there, where Equiano, who we'll talk more about in a minute, Equiano, also Vassa, we will decide what to call him, but historians have usually called him Equiano, where he talks about what it was like to be kidnapped from home, and he describes this memory as a child of what happened. He is sold to another family, and he works, here he is being enslaved in a faraway place from his own home, but still inside of the continent of Africa. And then also bought and sold again and traded. And at this point, this last trade, he's taken and walked to the coast. And so the internal trade is this process of people collecting other people for slavery, sometimes remaining in Africa, but for the vast majority of the time, heading to the coast. And so we get to the external slave trade, which is where people arrive on the coast and are sent on slave ships over to the Americas on what's called the Middle Passage. This is an image of a still standing slave fortress in Cape Coast, Ghana, which is now a memorial and a site for reckoning and reflecting on slavery and the millions of lives that were forever changed by having to pass through these walls. It's really difficult to learn about the experience of slavery and the slave trade, I think, for a variety of reasons. One is that most slaves were not taught to read and write, so we don't have any records that way. slavery owners are either uninterested in the experience of slavery or unwilling to keep the records of people they've controlled and enslaved and dominated. So we don't have a lot of record keeping from the owner's side. One thing that has been really helpful for historians is looking at ships' logs. There's a fantastic database that I invite you to explore. You can get to it at slavevoyages.org. And it's been this international project of scholars to actually put together all of the ship manifests, the logs, which ships left, which cities, who was the captain, how many people did they pick up in which place, how many people made it. And so it's a way to at least study kind of the macro, the big picture version of slavery. But you also get the small version. You can look at the actual list of who's on these ships, how old they're estimated to be. Are they men or women? Where are they from? And really think about the human cost of 12 million people. So I invite you to go there. There's a video you can watch. There's also a really helpful rendering of a slave ship. Like a recreation by computer. So I think that could be worth seeing as well. For historians, we have Equiano's narrative. And if you've studied slavery before, which I'm sure you have, in many textbooks, where you open up and there's like a little blurb about one person or a little primary source embedded in your textbook. If you're talking about slavery in the Middle Passage, chances are that person is going to be Equiano. He's extraordinarily famous both in his own lifetime and for historians as somebody who did learn to read and write, does get his freedom, and reflects back on the experience. And he's really one of the first people to publish that account. And so the words that we see here are the words that are coming from his narrative that have then been turned into these graphic narrative models. And so we have Equiano remembering that he arrives at port and to embark on the external slave trade. The Middle Passage is the voyage, the nickname of the transatlantic voyage that takes someone from Africa over to the Caribbean or North or South America. And so these are some different images that Equiano describes of what happens. And I invite you also to watch, I'll post the link for a clip from the film Amistad, which also has a really dramatic recreation of what it was like. This is a drawing from the period of the slave ship Brooks. And this is the description, amazingly powerful description Equiano gives about the closeness of the place, the heat of the climate, right? It's so crowded, scarcely has room to turn himself, almost suffocating us. It smells, everyone's cramped together, everyone's sick, it's filthy, people are shrieking, people are dying and groaning. I mean, it's really, really horrific to read about it. And so I think that's something you encounter in Equiano's own words, and you can encounter also in the clip from Amistad, which I was not able to embed here because of the live lecture. But here's a still from the actual period from a different ship. Let's look particular at Equiano and what his story is and kind of why does it matter. So this is the title of his book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Eluda Equiano or Gustavus Vassa. He's got both names here. If you already engaged in the module, you know a little bit about him and you know about this debate that historians have. Where is Equiano really from? Was he really born in South Carolina or was he really born in Africa? So this is something I want you to dive in and understand more. But in order for you to kind of care, I want you to know a little bit about who he is and what his story is. So from his autobiography, which is a really amazing, it's part adventure story, him gaining his freedom. It's part growing up story. A young man turns into an adult. It's also a story of Christian conversion and how he became a believer in Christianity. So he's got kind of it's an advice book. So there's really a lot going on in his one tale. Like you saw earlier, so he is from Africa. He's stolen from his family, traded to another African, and then eventually brought to the coast for the Atlantic or Middle Passage. He arrives in Barbados in the Caribbean. He's first offered for sale in 1756 and is not bought. But then later he is bought by Michael Henry Pascal and taken to Virginia. And Pascal agrees to let him learn to read and write, which is very unusual. He also teaches him to sail, and Equiano works as a crewman on a boat for 7 years. During the 7 Years' War. But still, he's not freed, which he thought he was going to, and he felt very betrayed. He ends up in England. He's baptized in 1759, and we have that actual record, which you'll see, and I think it's important that you download that and look at that and think about kind of what that means. There's a picture of the church in London where he's baptized. He's sent from there back to the West Indies, where he's bought by a Philadelphia Quaker who lets him hire himself out on the side. And they have an arrangement that if Equiano can raise as much money as this man paid for him, he could buy his freedom. And so like kind of on the side, like he's moonlighting, he's able to earn enough money. He actually comes to Savannah in the 1760s. He's here quite a lot. And I just want to tell you a little bit about it because it's kind of amazing to imagine Equiano right here in our neck of the woods. He talks about going there and he goes up and down the boats with the cargo ships, and he talks about being frequently beset by alligators. If you ever spent time in the waterways here, you know that is not uncommon. He says that they're pretty scary. He shot many of them. We have had with much great difficulty, sometimes prevented, and have been very much frightened at them. So they're trying to get up on the boats, and so that's one of his memories of Savannah. He also talks about being here one time, and he gets into a fight with a slave owner, with a slave, and the slave's owner demands that he be flogged. And he says he really dreads that, and he says he'd rather die than be turned over to the local authorities. And so he ends up hiding out for 5 days in Yamacraw village with the Native Americans to try to avoid arrest. At this point, when he's doing all this traveling in Savannah, he has bought his freedom, and so he's free now, and he works as a sailor. So he makes a deal with this captain who he pays the other guy off and lets him back on the ship, but he talks about that negative experience. He's back again in Savannah in 1767, and he went to a friend's house, and they stayed up talking inside until about 9 or 10 p.m. And then a patrolman came by, he knocks on the door, and he comes in and actually has some punch with them, and then turns to both of them and says, "You're under arrest," because it was a law in Savannah that any, quote, Negro in the house after 8 o'clock was not allowed to have a light on. So really he feels like he's been entrapped almost. And so they have to either pay some dollars or be flogged. He doesn't have any dollars, so he's taken in. He watches them flog, severely whip another black man and woman the next morning, and he's told he's next. He insists to them that he's free and that this is not fair and this is not appropriate, and they end up letting him call for the local doctor, somebody he knew, and the doctor comes and vouches for him, and he's let go without being flogged, but really only by this coincidence that he knew somebody who could vouch for him. Here's another bad experience in Savannah. It's unfortunate that all of them are bad experiences in Savannah, but maybe that's typical of a free black man at the time. He's walking a little out of town, and he said he's, quote, beset by 2 white men who mean to play their usual tricks with me in the way of kidnapping. So he hears one of them say to the other, "This is just the very fellow we were looking for that you lost." Meaning, this is a runaway slave, right? Kind of wink, wink. Let's re-enslave this person. Let's claim that he's run away from you, and we'll take him back. He turns on them, and he says, luckily he's carrying a big stick. And they're impressed with the quality of his English and the way he speaks. And so he sort of frightens them off and intimidates them, and he runs off and is able to be free. But he feels like he's just narrowly missed being put back into slavery again. His final encounter is actually really, I think, more sentimental and more positive. The day he's supposed to leave, a black woman from Savannah with a dead child asks him if he could perform our ceremony. He's kind of surprised. He's not a priest, but she says nobody else will do it, and he doesn't want to leave her kind of brokenhearted with nobody attending to her child. And so he, quote, acted the person and does the service. And he's surprised because in the audience, in the congregation of people who've come together is mixed black and white race. And so I think he finds that kind of unusual. And he ends up sailing out of Savannah to go back to the Caribbean, not to return again, but just kind of have this connection. While we're talking about Savannah, I just want to mention that the biggest slave auction in history in America happens in Savannah in 1859. It's nicknamed the Weeping Time. And there's a really beautiful, powerful account. A reporter from New York had come down and interviewed people. Colonel Butler of South Carolina wanted to sell off a lot of the enslaved people on his plantation to pay his debts. And so they're all kind of scattered around, and their families are separated. People have lived together, generations are separated. And this reporter in 2019, this photographer comes down to Savannah and takes a photograph of the exact spot. So this is a picture from the New York Times Magazine, the 1619 series, which is really powerful and excellent. I recommend you peruse it if you haven't yet. And so this is sort of Savannah in 2019 reflecting this exact spot for where the Weeping Time. There is a marker there, which is not in this this picture, but it's obviously a place that no one really goes very much. So just kind of connecting up world history with Georgia history, and to see that all this stuff is really not so long ago and far away, that a lot of it is still, you know, really present in our own geography, which I think is kind of amazing. So you guys will be thinking about Equiano and what and where he comes from and what he says and how historians deal with documents. So we have this long narrative that he himself wrote, that the graphic novel, the graphic images come from. We have also these archival records, the records from the church where he's baptized in London. And we have a record from one of the ships that he volunteered on later to go to the Arctic, where he signed up as Gustavus Weston. So his name is Gustavus Vassa, so they've translated that as Weston. He says he's 28 years old here. And he does have this sort of amazing adventurous life where he travels around. So not only his traveling, you know, up and down the coast of America, but also he goes to obviously the Central America and the Caribbean, but to the Arctic, to England. He ends up presenting a petition to abolish slavery to Queen Charlotte in 1788. And in 1789, he publishes his book. This is the same year the French Revolution breaks out, so it's a really big, important year. He's on a big book tour. He's like one of the first people to do like a celebrity book tour. This book is so popular. When it's published, it is translated into lots of different languages almost right away. And he gains a lot of fame as a celebrity, and people are reading it in America and Russia, in Holland and France. This exciting story of what happened to an enslaved person turned freeman. And he meets a woman, an English woman, Susanna Cullen, on his book tour. And they meet in 1792, and they end up getting married. And then he has two daughters, Anna Maria and Joanna. Both of them take the last name Vassa. And one of them outlives him and inherits kind of the money that he's made in his life. So he's kind of a really interesting and important figure to pay attention to. This issue that you're debating is, you know, where is he really from? Because we have, in the book, he says Africa, but then in these documents you see it says Carolina, South Carolina. And so how do historians reconcile the fact that we have different accounts of where he's from? And that's a thing that you really need to think about. You have two worksheets that you need to do. You'll see them come up. I've got them also in folio. So one is assembling the evidence. And this is you trying to work with what's going on, what the module is telling you. And then be a historian trying to sift through the evidence. So what we're trying to do is get to a point where you have a strong opinion about where Equiano Vassa was born, and you have evidence to base that, to back up your assertion. And so that's what we're trying to get to with this module. I hope this overview helped make some sense of what's going on and understand the scale. Again, I recommend you watch the Amistad scene to learn more, and go to slavevoyages.org to explore a little bit more as well. And I appreciate your attention today, and reach out with questions. Thank you.